Hey everybody, I'm Scott Harkey and welcome to season 4 of Endava's Payment Talks, where we dive headfirst into understanding how companies are shaping the direction of payments innovation. Today's episode focused on Paydoc's pioneering role in the payment sector, providing innovative solutions for banks and merchants alike. Super delighted today to have Rob Lincoln, founder and CEO of Paydoc, with us. Hey Rob, how's it going?
Hi Scott, thanks for having me. Great to be joining here today. I'm looking forward to a
Awesome.
solid chat.
Yeah, as always, as always. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself? How did you come to found Paydoc, and maybe a little bit of your background that led to that as well?
Yeah, thanks Scott. Look, I'm Rob. I'm a Tasmanian, which is an island state off the coast of Australia. For those of you who don't know where it is, most people visit Australia and either forget that Tasmania is there, or I've seen some maps recently where it doesn't exist at all. So I have to keep flying the Tasmanian flag. But I've been living in
I was
London
going to say,
since,
is
yeah.
that always your intro? Hey, I'm Rob. I'm a Tasmanian. Like that. That's
Well,
unique.
I'm very proud of it. You're one of 500,000, but I think somebody's got to fly the flag, right? So I'm going to do
Right
it.
on.
One day we'll have the Democratic People's Republic of Tasmania, with our own flag. But we'll see how it goes with the global warming migration, as everyone wants to find little islands in the ocean. But look, proud Tasmanian. I've been living in London since 2018. Got a wife and two kids there now, which is great. And I've been in the payment space, it feels like, since I was born. Pioneering, challenging it, pushing it, poking it, really out of university. So the better part of the last 20 years have been in the space. More recently, running and founding and running Paydoc as co-CEO here now. We've been doing this since 2015, looking to solve a really distinctive set of problems for largely banked and non-bank acquirers and ultimately their merchants. But the payment space is always interesting, and we definitely nerd out on it quite a lot. But that's me, Aussie in London, and very pleased to be talking some payments with you today.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I've been to Australia a few times, but have not made it to Tasmania. So I'll have to prioritize that in my trip next time.
Yeah, added to
Um,
the list. Yeah, yeah. Shake those preconceived ideas about Tasmanian devils and all the evil things I hear.
right on. Well, one of the interesting things about this conversation, so we work a lot in the payment spaces in Java, and quite a bit around payment orchestration, usually
Mm,
from the merchant or acquirer perspective. I think what would be interesting is to hear a little bit from you about how the banks think about orchestration, and because that's a topic we kind of explore a lot less. So from the bank angle, what's the kind of key use cases or value around orchestration? What role are they playing? Maybe give us a little insight around that.
yeah, the bank angle, Scott, is I would have to say one of the most interesting angles of orchestration. I think we all get and understand the retail proposition, which is the that merchants want all the things. At Paydoc, we think about it as a hierarchy of needs. First of all, merchants say, hey, look, I want all the things. I want like various processes, APMs, BNPLs. I want to wrap around some fraud. I want to do some identity, maybe some propensity modeling. Maybe I want to do a dynamic checkout. Maybe I'm thinking about AI on my checkout. This is classic orchestration. And while that's value additive, well, the industry that we're looking at, the corner of the industry we're looking at, is one where we have a major burning platform, which is a combination of tech debt, growth by acquisition, 20, 30 year old legacy platforms. And that's creaking. But I guess that tech debt corner that's really serviced by the high street banks and the major acquirers and the FIs, that's still servicing the majority of processing volume. And they're desperate to have sticky merchant relationships. And what's changed in the payments industry is that the main financial institution for a merchant is shifting from where you put your deposits to who handles your payments. And so the attrition that these large brands have been experiencing, really starting 2018, 2019, building pace every year, now through to about 20% of their merchant base has been lost. That's going to look like closer to 40% by the end of 2025, moving to 2026. That's Nielsen data. That attrition is beginning to get noticed. And so we've got a lot of these big payments brands going, well, how do I modernize my stack? how do I do it in a way that provides a best-in-class merchant experience? And how do I future-proof my operations so that I'm not always trying to play catch-up with the fintech? So it's what we would call orchestration-oriented, acquirer-oriented orchestration. It's slightly a new concept, but it's an old problem. It's been growing for a while. And it sits at that intersection of the legacy issues on one hand and the voracious merchant appetite for all the things on the right hand side. And you put those two things in the middle, and then you've got what Paydoc does, which is phenomenally exciting.
So how do you help them solve that problem? Is it they use your platform as instead of using some of the other technology? Is it you wrap around the outside of that? Like how do you help them?
Yeah, well, if you're a major payment brand, a major processor, and you want to stay relevant, you've got some choices, right? You can build something that'll cost you 300 million, then you've got the cost to maintain it. And you're building that in a context of some pretty well-established fintechs who are moving really fast and providing products, features that you're going to struggle to be able to develop. Banks don't have a fantastic history of software development. They're great at other things. And so you're looking at, do we build from scratch to try and catch up and retain our merchants? That's become increasingly unpalatable. Maybe 3-4 years ago could have been an option. The other one is to buy. So do we rent a white label gateway? What do we do there? And that strategy is getting quite old as well, because you're finding that merchants are looking at single gateway strategies and going, well, we used to do single strategy, but now I'm thinking about moving into this country, and then I'm thinking about that APM and that national debit scheme, and I need to have this ISV integration running across the top of all that. And so merchants are starting to think differently about these single stack gateways. So if you're a high street acquirer, you're thinking, how do I retain my merchants? How do I stop them drifting off to some of the fintechs? Do I flip out my stack, do some open heart surgery? Do I build from scratch? Or do I partner? And that's where it gets really interesting. And so what we do at Paydoc is we can roll out with a major FI in less than 6 months, and we can give them something that meets the merchant appetite under their own brand, meets the merchant appetite as it sits right now without requiring that open heart transformation. And renting a solution instantly is far better than the risk and cost that comes with a major build and maintain product, or even just leverage it, pulling something down off the shelf that's going to be behind the eight ball the minute that you pull it down and deploy it. So orchestration in this context provides a really interesting paradigm shift for the industry. And by way of anecdote, I remember when we started Paydoc in the first couple of years, we knew that it was going to be these incumbents who were really going to want to find creative ways to retain their merchants with lower tech budgets, less time to deploy. And I remember at the time, this was 2018, this is when Nielsen really started tracking the fintech versus high street delta. And we were told by a major bank, well, we know there's a bit of a pain, but merchants aren't actually leaving. And that was around 2018, 2019. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing that erosion is really accelerating pace. And the thing that we hear most frequently is we want sticky merchants. And what creates sticky merchants? Providing great value fast. And I think that's where we've been adding some benefit actually for a few years now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely have seen the push into that space from the large acquirers and the bank acquirers specifically. Do you feel like that's cyclical at all? I feel like a lot of the banks used to be heavy into the acquiring space, and really that was core. And then a bunch of
Mm,
them got out of it, right? Sold off those businesses or otherwise got out of it. Now it's coming back around and they're getting back in it.
yeah.
What do you feel like it just comes and goes as the economy or some other external factor shifts it, or is it just
Yeah.
usual changes in strategy?
Yeah, great question. Definitely cyclical. I agree with you. You'll have a, a cohort of management saying, "Hang on, this is high risk. It's not really making us any money. Let's get rid of it. It's some old legacy stack." And then you'll see other FIs looking at it going, "Well, hold on a second. Merchants drive deposits. Deposits are our cheapest form of capital, and there's more data than ever now around the fact that if you have a merchant services account, it actually drives greater deposits." And some of the data that we have is fascinating here to say, well, look, You may not make a lot of money on the acquiring itself, but you sure as hell make a lot of money on the merchant and offering interest-bearing products and holding deposits. And an incredible data point that's little known in the industry is that for every, this is approximate, of course, but for every merchant services account that a banked acquirer has, that merchant holds 40% more on deposit than a merchant who they don't have an acquiring service for. So you think about, these fintechs who are hoovering up merchant services, and then interest rates are a little bit higher than they used to be. Then they get a deposit taking license. Then they start offering some, who knows, cash flow financing. And so we're seeing attrition in net interest income and attrition in deposits, not just acquiring revenue. So there are some banks out there who are looking at the holistic merchant lifecycle, going, actually, merchant services is important. It's a driver of deposits and everything that drives a bank. And I think that's an educational process, to be really honest with you. It takes time to recognize what the left hand and the right hand are doing and how they're connected. And I think a large symptom of that is because acquiring sort of has been, the baby's been in a corner for a while. But I think it is coming back into fashion now as people realize the connection between merchant services and deposits. For some banks, they'll make a decision to move in a different direction. For others, they'll want to leverage what orchestration has to offer to drive some increased deposits. I think there's
Yeah.
another angle. Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the
Yeah,
non-bank acquirer side. Yeah, the non-bank acquirer side is fascinating as well, because they've grown through acquisition for the last 5-6 years. And they've got, different gateways, different APIs all around the world. And they're trying to find ways to simplify that for the merchant in the way that Stripe and others do very quickly. And orchestration as this, single pane of glass, this thin strategic layer, provides a really interesting lens to look at the problem. And so some of them have gone out to build orchestration layers. Some of them even bought orchestrators like Paydoc and others. I think the challenge there is, one objection we hear quite a lot as well, is really not that hard. I'm 9 years in. It's really hard. It's really, really hard to do really well. And, the people that we've got here are some of the best people in the industry, people who used to run banking stacks, people who ran entire books of businesses across, continents for gateways, in our team. They know how hard it is too. And I think that's what excites people about Paydoc. We're not trying to cut other people's grass. We're trying to add value where there is value to be added, and help your big brands retain their merchants. That's really what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting points in there. So one, the bank view of the kind of total customer value, right? That's easy to see from the outside. Well, of course it makes sense for banks to invest in these relationships with their merchants, with their customers, because there are all these other ways to monetize them. It's funny, to your point though, how hard that can be to actually execute on within the bank though, because merchant services is so traditionally a separate, not just a
Yeah.
business unit, but sometimes it's even a separate entity, right? Like
Yeah.
it'll be a partnership with some other entity, or it'll be kind of over here because they sold it off and then bought it back or whatever. But it rarely has kind of single line leadership within the financial institution that allows for that thinking to say, well, actually, yeah, we might not make that much money on this part, but if we can add, if we can sell more to that customer through all these other services, then we can increase the total
Yeah.
value of that relationship or customer, which
Yeah.
is the exact opposite of how the fintechs look at it. Of that's their default, right? Like, what's the total customer value? Well, we can sell a merchant. You just look at Stripe and look at all the different stuff they offer.
Yeah.
Whether that's the right strategy or not, there couldn't be a better articulation of like, we want a single customer and we want to offer them this wide swath of stuff, because that every little thing just adds more value from that customer, right? That's more revenue that customer is going to bring in. So it's
That's right.
it's almost like an unfair starting point for the fintechs versus the banks in that thinking. And just it is a really clear point of where the organizational structure can have a huge impact on approach to business and business models, just by
Yeah.
nature of what matters to any individual stakeholder within the bank. Well, their P&L, right? They might like the idea that adds value to someone else's P&L, but they're not really often going to make decisions that necessarily align to that.
Yeah.
So that becomes a real advantage for a lot of the fintechs for sure, and a real impetus, I think, for the banks to start thinking differently about these things, as you've articulated.
Yeah. Scott, bang on, mate. We see that paradigm every single day, and everything that you mentioned, we hear and we resonate with. I'm thinking about your comment about the P&L, that the siloed P&L, I call it. That's that's actually a hazard to shareholder value in the current structure, and I think what's changing there, and particularly in terms of the stakeholders that we engage with now at banks and acquirers, is we'll end up talking to somebody who has that high level view of the P&L, and they can see a little bit more of what the left hand and the right hand is doing. And so
Right.
traditionally you might sell to someone in the acquiring vertical, and they're under the pump. Margins are thinner, tech budget's not what they used to be. The whole thing seems like a bit of a dog. Um, and then on the other hand, you've got somebody in the merchant bank, going, well, we woke up this morning and such a merchant, there's less deposits than there were last year. Where's that gone? Not realizing that X acquirer now is offering a financial services product, and they're leaving a little bit of their money up there and seeing how that goes, which is plays into Stripe's hands, and and full stack fintechs like them. And I read a great article this week on Stripe's strategy of hoovering up tech products, not going out and buying other gateways, because they're landing through merchant services and expanding through value-added services. And
Right.
you even look at the transition of revenue for the big card schemes to value-added services, that's now 30-40% of their book coming out of nowhere, because that's so much money to be made there. So I think Stripe's got the memo. I think what the high street banks are going to have to start doing is embracing their merchants, or risk their underlying deposits and their underlying net interest income. And the data will catch up eventually. So right now we're sitting at about 20% attrition in Europe. So you've got 20% of the volume is through the fintechs, 80% still with the high street, your big brands, but there's a direction to travel. And that's going to start hitting all the other P&Ls. So I think the most engaged institutions we have are those who can reconcile the different P&Ls to understand the relationship between the two. And not everyone's going to get the memo. That's okay. It's a big payments world out there. And I think some are just going to throw in the white towel, and others are going to say, no, we want to fight for our merchants. And they're the brands we love talking to. And I guess what excites me about what we do in our underlying proposition is, once a bank rolls out our technology, not only are they meeting or exceeding their merchant expectations, but it's also a conduit for so much value add. So, is it value adds through the schemes? Is it third-party value adds that you can introduce to your checkout flow? And you do it by pushing a button, not through coding. And that is a new paradigm, because the old way of doing payments was, here you go, have another API, have fun with that, and the developers are like, well, hang on, I got a 2-year backlog. I got a core business to focus on. What's this now? Yet another noisy thing from my product team about another payment method I have to take, or even worse, one I got to wire off because they went out of business or they were consolidated and I don't like what they do anymore. So that
Right.
whole just ebb and flow and the noise of the payment space, Paydoc really helps take that frustration out at a technical level, but also, increasingly we're preaching to the people who have control of the P&L, who understand the high level view of the merchant. And I would say there's a bit of a renaissance happening around acquiring now, because I think that data is starting to trickle through. And that data is being driven by insight from people like Bain and others now, who are increasingly recognizing, what Stripe and others have known for a long time. Hold on to your merchant, upsell in every different direction where you're adding value, and look at your overall book of business grow. And as a consequence, you'll have loyal customers that'll leave their deposits with you. You live to fight another day. What you don't have is 400 million in the bank in 5 years. You've got to find a way to do it in
Right.
6 months as a service. You have to now. Well, at least I say that as a founder and CEO. But I thought that have to moment was a couple of years ago. But it's really gathering steam now.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Talking about new payment methods, let's talk a little bit about account to account. So, depending on where you sit in the world, this account to account has all kinds of different, let's say, implementations and just varying degrees of how real it is, how impactful it is, et cetera. when you look at it and you look at it, whether it's in the markets you're serving or just generally kind of how you think about it impacts what you guys do, is it just another payment method? Do you think it fundamentally changes anything about the ecosystem? Are there winners and losers when it comes to account payments as a payment method? Maybe tell me a little bit about what you think there.
Yeah. Look, account to account's really interesting paradigm changer, I think. Um, I think I think life is about incentives. I think business is about incentives. And I think some of the resistance we've seen in various pockets of the industry to account really come down to competing incentives and a lack of clarity as to will will incumbent institutions lose money? Who's going to start winning? But the underlying maturity of the technology is increasing by the day. And you look at what's happening in the UK, that's starting to become more and more viable, particularly with refunds now coming into scope and some standing orders and things like this. It's becoming to be more robust as a holistic proposition. We've seen other markets, particularly in South America and others, where it's really taken off, Japan as well. And that's been mixed with QR, over the counter, everything else. So from an orchestration point of view, we get really excited about that because it's more choice for the consumer, uh, more flexibility for the merchant. And orchestration changes the uptake paradigm because you don't have to wait for a massive beast to integrate it before you can pull it down off the tree through an orchestrator. So orchestrators accelerate fintech adoption generally. That's one of the
Right.
dynamics they bring to the table. Like just the pace picks up of the industry as a whole, which I love. But your question about, is it a thing? Yeah, I think it's a massive thing. You see merchants asking for it all the time, and they want to have it at the right time for the right use case. They don't want to miss out on the value they believe it can bring, and they're looking to orchestrators to accelerate their ability to uptake the value it can offer. They're not looking to their high streets necessarily to do this anymore. They're looking to either go direct or to work with an orchestrator. So the appetite is there, the demand is there, the functionality is becoming increasingly mature in more markets than ever. It ain't going backwards, and I think we just got to decide as an industry how we're going to respond. And I don't think you can stop it because you got the regulator. Regulators might not be the fastest movers in the world, but they are trying to set up some hedges to ensure this thing comes in sooner or later. Hell or high water, it will be there, and you can't make it go away.
Yeah, the
So
cat's out of the
it's a
bag
thing.
now.
Yeah, cat's out of the bag. And I think the consumer side's getting easier and easier now with like QR, bit of Face ID. You're done. So, I'm from the UK. With your Monzo, I can then stitch that in with some loyalty or something. We'll see more and more use cases start coming through, I think.
Yeah, one of the interesting, I guess, mental pivots for me was so in the US, it's less mature, right? In that one, we won't have regulators really push it because that's just not how our regulators work. And two, the big banks have a real resistance to, let's say, speeding up the adoption of account to account for obvious reasons, right?
Yeah,
They make a lot of money off of interchange here
yeah.
in the US, so there's a lot of protection there. But I remember I'm part of the Faster Payments Council here in the US, and we
Okay.
had one of the sessions, and a representative from Walmart was there and was talking about account to account. And he made the comment of, they think about it as a payment method and they want it to come from their acquire or their processor, just like every other payment method.
Mm.
And that I hadn't really thought about it that way because we do so much work with banks that I was thinking, all right, well, the banks are going to position this. Visa and MasterCard have products that can help the banks that are smaller position this. But when the largest merchant in the country was saying like, no, actually, we don't want to mess with any of that. We want
Yeah.
it to come from our current gateway or acquire, just like any other payment method, because that's how we want to consume it. That really kind of clicked something for me mentally of okay, so kind of like what you said, right? Like the merchants wanting this to be available to them, they want to treat it like another payment method that they can use in the right way for the right customer at the right time. And that kind of sums up the whole space right now to me, right? All these different payment methods, whether it's things like buy now, pay later, or it's things like account to account or more traditional card or
Mm.
whatever it may be, the merchant or retailer ask is all about how do I get the right options for the right customer at the right time. And I think that's some maturity, right? And that creates a lot of space for orchestration and gateways and all kinds of things that I think are why we see so much growth in that space right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. I think Walmart going, hey, we want this from our acquirer. I would have thought potentially naively that Walmart would have said, look, we have our own orchestration platform, whatever they're doing. So we don't really care where we get it from as long as we get it and we can stay agile. But I think there's still a lot of trust in, the balance sheet and the
Yeah.
brands and the risk posture of the large acquirers. And I think a large acquirer working with an orchestrator like PayDocs, so we're a tier one orchestrator. We go through all the same checks and balances that a scheme does in working with our banking partners. It's bank grade technology. I think the major merchants are looking for that level of confidence in who they're consuming through. So I think again, banks do and acquirers have a leading role to play in capitalizing on these changes. So rather than running away from them, putting your head in the sand, actually embracing them and running ahead with them. And one of the interesting paradigm shifts that orchestration brings, particularly for an acquirer, and what we've seen in the market, is that if an acquirer comes to the market and says, look, I can give you access to all the things now. I'll give you open banking. I'll give you access to alternative payment methods and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to charge you, a click or processing fee across the top. Merchants are happy to pay it. So,
Yeah.
Walmart would be happy to pay for that privilege. And what's incredible about that is all of a sudden the acquirer is making money from transactions they would have never even seen before.
Exactly.
And this
Exactly.
is like, no one's talking about that. I'm like, well, that's a light on moment. It's like, so me, Mr. Major Bank, I can make some money from these PayPal transactions, and I wouldn't even seen those transactions before, let alone made money from them, other than maybe, yeah, you can every single click. And these are some of the lights on moments that orchestration can bring to a larger, like at least with what we do. So I'm really excited about that, and like what the FedNows do in the US, etc. I think once you realize there's money to be made in supporting the rollout of open banking, yeah, any change is huge in the US, but actually merchants are willing to pay for choice as well. And how do you capitalize on that and then harvest, harvest a market ahead of your competitors? And then you can value add it as well, right? And so back to our point
Yeah.
about value adding, then you can layer on value adds. You're back to where you began, maybe even ahead. Some of the modeling shows. So really interesting stories coming out of the US, I think, in times to come. Really interesting to hear that Walmart comment, because I thought Walmart would have been like, well, we got our orchestration layer. We'll just pull down whatever we feel like tomorrow, and then if they're no good, we'll. But they
Yeah.
want to
Well,
buy from their acquirer. Yeah.
well, exactly. Well, I also imagine they have really good price negotiating with their acquirer, right? So by running it through a fewer number of parties, and they may even have more than one. I'm sure they have more than one
Yeah.
acquirer and a kind of couple they're spreading it out with. But I think there's a sophistication there of kind of the opposite side of what you just said. I completely agree that a lot of merchants want to be able to have a single entity that they get it from because it simplifies their um, the complexity on their side. On the flip side, you can look at it as essentially Walmart being able to negotiate hey, if we give you everything and you cover it, and sure, probably underneath there are multiple maybe sub acquirers or gateways or other things that are getting leveraged, but then they have visibility into everything as well. Because I think for a large merchant in particular, a lot of it comes down to you can handle the transaction for us, but we want to see everything about it because we're using that data and loyalty and another, customer acquisition and then customer relationship building. So a lot of times I think there's a willingness to maybe give over more responsibility to an entity because of the fact that in turn can give you better negotiating around the visibility into it or a deeper integration into what you
Yep.
can see, or you just
Yeah.
couldn't do that if you were trying to spread that across 10 different providers or whatever.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I think in general the inclusion of whether it's account to account or it's some of the real-time payment methods, et cetera, in the US, again, they come back to this idea of merchants wanting to provide choice to their customers, but don't want to take on the complexity of having to manage it. And again,
Yeah.
I think that's where orchestration and other things come into play, because it's, we want, if our customer wants to use that particular alternative payment method, or we have a way to, create a relationship to do account to account the right way, et cetera, we want that available. But we don't have as a merchant, we don't have the resources or the time or want to spend the money to go integrate into everything, right?
Yeah.
So if we can find providers that can offer us access to those things and the sophistication to turn it on or off. One of the more interesting things I heard recently was just around a merchant that was, they're real time on the checkout page, building the checkout options based on profiling of the customer, even when they didn't know the customer. So in the guest checkout flow, they were
Yeah.
able to use some of the data from how the customer had navigated the site to kind of profile the customer's profile a bit, and then
Sure.
offer payment methods based on that. There was another one around buy now, pay later. And again, just the buy now, pay later options themselves being tailored to their customer profile, to where they didn't offer certain ones. And again, nothing about the financial side of it, more just about the typical behavior and typical fraud in this case that they would see
Yeah.
sometimes from those kinds of customers, et cetera. So anyway, a lot of sophistication in that space, which is really exciting.
So much sophistication. And I mean, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. And the fact that merchants are willing to pay for this now, they see the value in it, should be a wake up call if you're like 2 generations behind as an old acquirer,
Right.
to where we started, and saying, well, it's not just the high street fintechs, it's also now the orchestrators that merchants are moving to. And I sat there, I was on a panel with the head of payments at Subway, the quick service restaurant, and I think he said there's no world in which we wouldn't use orchestration as our first line strategy, because it's a major distraction, it's a major risk, and the benefits that we can now get in terms of consumer experience, security, ability to interoperate with the industry in the different countries that we work with, it's becoming borderline hygiene for slightly more sophisticated merchants. And now, the orchestration platforms are getting more and more robust, they're getting more and more SMB friendly, less enterprisey. We're starting at the top and making our way down. And if you do a bit of Googling, you'll see that payments orchestration is at a 25% compound annual growth rate. And that's compared to, 10, 11-ish,
Yeah.
depending on the country, on e-com. So it's more than twice the growth rate of e-com as a whole. The merchants are spending money. That's opportunity for, I think, these acquirers to go, well, hold up, how do I leapfrog, from where I am, leapfrog the single vendor fintech and straight into this orchestration paradigm that, a lot of merchants want. The only thing blocking them from moving straight to an orchestrator is an existing contract somewhere that they're waiting to wind down, or some investment they've made in some tech stack, and they'll just wait for next year's budget or the year after. So I think we're going to see that growth rate continue, because to your point, if you're a merchant and you're going, I know compared to this retailer over here, I can do propensity-based checkout flows where I know that Rob always turns up, he always pays with Apple Pay, he always does this. I'm just going to hide everything else and put it under a button so he
Yep.
gets the optimum, wow. And that we can do that on a completely agnostic framework. Now, payments framework is a really exciting day in payments. And, then we can start talking about, well, what am I going to do about omni-channel? What am I going to do about over the counter? What can I do about account to account? What's the connection between account to account and payouts? How do I do many out as well as many in? There's some great wallet providers. How do I synchronize those workflows? All this stuff gets really interesting, and we're going to see orchestrators looking at use cases. They're going to be, I think, more vertically oriented as well. Some for travel, some for high risk, some for. We're going to get more and more stratified as we're still a young industry, right? But it's growing quite fast. So these are some of the things that really excite us and get us out of it. But I love that ultimate benefit to the consumer, because that's what it's about. And when we have our retailers saying to us, oh, we spoke with such and such processor, we really like what they do, or such and such fraud platform, can you hurry up and integrate them, Paydoc? Our greatest challenge is to just get out of our own way and help the industry accelerate now that the lights have gone on. And we'd love to help those who have the most merchants on their books, so the most to lose but the most to gain. And I think about all the fintechs that are coming in, 1,500 plus. I mean, how many fintechs come in a day? New fintechs a year? I don't know, but the rate at which we see them popping up and sometimes dying as well, Uh, you know, we want to be able to say to, you know, the founder of a great new payment method in some country, yeah, pop on the rail, away you go. Merchants can adopt you, available today on the app store type experience. That's what payments should become. It should become, and it's available today on the app store. It shouldn't be another, you know, 12-month coding
Yep.
nightmare. You know, it should just be push the button, turns on, doesn't work, turn it off. You know, you got no risk, you got no cost. It just works or it doesn't. Like, that's where we want to take payments together.
I'm sure that's a future many retailers would be excited by, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Um,
Easier said
all
than done.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're not there yet, but it's a good aspirational goal. Um, all right, Rob, it's been a fantastic conversation. Anything you want to point us towards as kind of parting thoughts, or anything super exciting on the horizon that you want to close us out with today?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Look, I think orchestration is just getting into gear. I think it's, you know, it is to payments what, you know, Amazon is to retail. It's going to change the industry. It's already changing the industry more than people know. I think the closing thought, as I think about your audience, is to think about, you know, what benefits can orchestration provide acquirers and, you know, non-bank acquirers, both bank to non-bank, in terms of simplifying their stack and supporting their merchants. I think we're going to see a lot of housekeeping under the table as orchestrators like PayDoc come in, support the merchant layer, but enable a lot of deck chair shuffling beneath as legacy tech gets flushed out. And I think we're going to see this large sort of housekeeping and technical consolidation, housekeeping happening as well in the industry over the next few years. This status quo isn't really working. And then as part of that, we're going to see a big pickup in the velocity of new fintech entering the market, adoption of account to account, and everything else. So I think 25% growth rate year on year right now, that's cool. I think that'll keep going for a pretty long, you know, next 3-4 years. And I really want to see a couple of big brands, big banking brands go, yes, we can step back into merchant services and win. Because I think that's something that a lot of people have lost some faith in, but I think we can change that narrative a little bit.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I know it's a U.S. example, but the probably the biggest thing here is Bank of America, and the fact that, you know, a couple of years ago they got back in the merchant acquiring space directly, as opposed, you know, got out of their first
Yeah.
data kind of JV, got back into the space directly, and have really made some acquisitions since then, and really pushing hard into the space. I think that's a good example of when you're going for it, right? And the recognition of the importance of that, and certainly they're at the scale where they have the opportunity to make it meaningful. But
Yeah,
I think that's certainly something that we can look for more organizations to do.
I hope so. Merchants, man, they got to be in the middle. If you do that, the rest is easy. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks,
All
Scott.
right. Well, yeah, thank you. That's all for today's episode of Payment Talks. Just a big thank you to you, Rob, for joining us and sharing your insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for the latest in payments innovation. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and links are in the description. Until next time, I'm Scott Harkey, and this has been Payment Talks.